Got a couple of things I'm going to go through this morning. Mostly it's going to be from the scripture, of course, but there's a section I want to go through that discusses something that's wrong in our society. And I think you'll see what I mean as we go through it. And some will argue that, well, it's over almost 100 years old that this actually occurred. No, it's occurring right now. But it's something that we forget. In this pure religion, to care for the fatherless and the widows, the orphans and the widows, was an important part of God's plan from the very beginning. We, for example, find in Deuteronomy chapter 15, in the course of the writing of the law of Moses itself, God says, if among you one of your brothers should become poor in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother. It's important to know that God intended we should open our hands to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. And I like that phrase, whatever it may be. The poor, it's an important part of our history. It's an important part of our culture, important part of our society. But the poor have often been looked down upon. They've actually been looked at as being the ones who are not blessed by God, the ones who perhaps are even cursed by God. And as a result, we've thought of them as being unimportant or even expendable. Evolution influenced eugenics movements in the latter part of the 1800s and the early 1900s, both in Europe and in America. Now, we don't remember that because most of us were born after that. Most of us. But the idea is that people thought they could improve the human race. In fact, the word eugenics itself means well-born. That is the idea that we have someone who is proper to be born. And literally, they thought those who weren't quite as good were not as proper to be born. They argued for the improvement of the human race by limiting reproduction of the unfit. Now, the unfit would be those they deemed unfit to reproduce. These would be people with mental or physical disabilities, people who scored in the low ranges of IQ tests, criminals, of course, deviants, and deviant could be any definition you wanted practically, and members of disfavored minority groups. I like that one. Just because you're a different minority group or a different race, you automatically would be at risk of being one of those that are considered unfit to reproduce. The eugenics movement became negatively associated with Nazi Germany, and as a result of that, first of all, remember that Nazi Germany exterminated, killed, murdered 11 million people during the course of World War II and the time period in which they were doing their thing. The people who were on trial afterward for war crimes used an argument that was kind of odd. They said the Nazi eugenics program is really no different than America's eugenics program. And you know what? They weren't that far off from the truth. There was a problem with that. Sweden and the U.S., for example, continued to carry out forced sterilizations for many decades during the 20th century. You know what forced sterilization is? That's castration or spaying or somehow or another fixing the women and the men so that they cannot reproduce. The idea of eugenics to decrease the birth of inferior human beings has existed at least since the 1800s, when an individual advocated the castration and spaying of the insane. Now, wouldn't you think the insane would be unfit for reproduction? I mean, we're not talking about something that's that outrageous, are we? Something that's that unreasonable? Well, Galton was a cousin of Darwin, and he read the book that Darwin had published on Origin of the Species, and he sought to explain the development of plant and animal species in a materialistic way, and he believed that desirable traits were hereditary based on biographical studies. Now, just very quickly, biographical studies means you talk to someone and hear their story. That's all they used to prove that these things were able to be done by heredity. The eugenics movement's moral aspects included rejection of the doctrine that all human beings are born equal. Now, wait a minute, that's one of the first things we see in some of our documents of freedom in the American Constitution, American Declaration of Independence, isn't it? All men are created equal. This says no, all men are not created equal. It redefines morality purely in terms of genetic fitness. Morality is not in terms of I deserve to live, but rather, do I deserve to live? If I am not fit for reproduction, then I don't deserve to live. The racist elements included a pursuit of a pure Aryan or white Northern European race, and the genetic pool of that and the eventual elimination of the less fit races. Now that makes sense to me, doesn't it? I mean, after all, us Northern Europeans, oh wait a minute, I'm a 57 mix now, so I don't fit that category anymore. The idea that this one race of people can actually be superior is not necessarily all that far-fetched when you look at evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory seems to make the idea, the promise, that we can, first of all, find the best, the most fit to reproduce, the ones that should, as well as the ones who should not reproduce and add to the gene pool. I kind of like a t-shirt I saw once that said, Darwinism is not about the survival of the fittest, it's the removal of the dumbest. Maybe that's true, but that's what they basically promised. That's what they preached. Genetic screening. I didn't know this wasn't going to show up that well, sorry. But genetic screening for various kinds of things. Genetic diseases. Now we have genetic diseases. By the way, you think this is just 100 years ago that this was being talked about. They did a research study recently in which 97% of everybody who had any kind of a testing for the fetus in the womb, the baby in the womb, in which Down syndrome was a possibility when they were born, chose instead to abort. You say this is something that's in past history? No, it's something that's now. This is something that's going on at this time. They promised differential birth weights. So, we need to actually propagate. We need to make sure that the people who should reproduce are forced to reproduce. Those who shouldn't reproduce, we should stop them from reproducing. Never mind what that says. Identifying and classifying individuals and their families included the poor, the mentally ill, the blind, and the deaf. Now, I mention that because the poor is specifically sectioned out. Now, you got to remember this is a time in which the rich were extremely rich. The opportunities in America were enormous. You had the Rockefellers. You had Carnegie. You had all kinds of others, J.P. Mellon and others that were coming up. And people thought that if you didn't fit into that nice, quite white society, you weren't acceptable and you weren't as good. And they thought that we should eliminate some of those as well. Developmentally disabled were chosen. Homosexuals were chosen. I like this one. Promiscuous women were on that list. I don't know why the promiscuous men weren't, but the promiscuous women weren't. They degenerate were considered unfit. Now, I bring this up because this is not biblical thinking, is it? This is not the way God intended. And here we have the segregation or institutionalizing of individuals, the separation of sterilization. Remember I said that Sweden and America continued sterilization policies way up into the 20th century, many decades after World War II. It was a matter of practice just to be able to stop them from having somebody else like themselves. Now, the problem with that, of course, is we know now that that's not necessarily valid. That individuals of low IQ are not necessarily the result of stupidity in their biological makeup, but rather because of lack of circumstance or opportunity, or in some cases, the family home. I've gone into homes, for example, and I've mentioned this before, one individual who was fairly literate himself, but there wasn't a single piece of written literature in his home. You walk in, there's no magazine on the counter, there's no magazine on the table, there's no book next to the sofa. They had the TV, but that's not literacy, is it? You know, that kind of circumstance can make a difference sometimes. The thing that's missing there in the bottom portion of this is their elimination. An actual murder was advocated. I'll get to that in just a moment. Programs in England, Germany, and America targeted various groups, and I like these groups. Jews. I'm not a Jew, so it's okay to target them, right? Homosexuals. I'm not homosexual, so it's okay to target homosexuals. Muslims, well, of course, we're Christians, so target the Muslims, right? The homeless, those with intellectual disabilities. We can target them because they're unfit for continued reproduction. These were ungodly and unbiblical thoughts and behaviors. For example, in Psalms, defend the poor and the fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and the needy. How in the world is that doing justice to the needy? To set them up for annihilation. You say, well, we didn't do that. Yes, we did. I'll get to that in a moment. Psalm 82, verse 4. Deliver the poor and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked. Protect them, in other words. Margaret Sanger founded a group called the American Birth Association or something like that. Later it became Planned Parenthood. Anybody heard of that? There are a group of churches here in Rio Rancho that are going to spend 40 days of marching in protest in front of a new Planned Parenthood office here in Rio Rancho. I would like to encourage us to become a part of that. All you do is carry a sign and walk back and forth in front of the storefront location. And by the way, just to make sure you know where it is, you know where the Albertsons is on Southern down here? There's an Arby's and there's Joe's Pasta House. It's back up in that little shopping area. And it's going to be opening up here pretty quick. Starting in September, we're going to spend 40 days marching in front of it. I don't know why 40. That's what they chose. But I mentioned Margaret Sanger for another reason. Margaret Sanger is, the Treasury Department is about to change the face on the $10 bill. They're talking about it. What they've done is they've opened up on their website an opportunity for you to vote or to suggest who should go on there. In particular, they want to focus on women in American history. And so they want to have a woman of substance of some sort, historically, to be placed on the dollar bill. 53% of the suggestions so far have suggested Margaret Sanger. I want to tell you about Margaret Sanger. She was a proponent of negative eugenics. That means you aim to improve human hereditary traits through social intervention by reducing the reproduction of those who were considered unfit. She actually advocated this in very strong terms on a number of occasions. She advocated the killing of babies to destroy defective genetic beings. Her organization, Planned Parenthood, was formed and directed to provide services as would help foster less births among the poor and the needy. Sanger said the greatest sin was to bring a child into this world and allow it to live. She did that on an actual television interview in the 1950s before she died. Now that's pretty strong language. You say, we don't have people advocating that now. Yes, we do. We've got people advocating it in a number of different ways. But just looking at the Planned Parenthood approach by itself, it was an outgrowth of the evolutionary thinking that led to the eugenics thinking, which was we can improve the human race by getting rid of the bad elements. Now, Sanger's arguments, perfectly honest with you, they weren't all just strictly because of evolutionary thinking. She wanted women to have freedom, control over their own bodies, freedom to do things. The chains that bound them to the home broken so that they didn't have to be limited anymore by such things. So she had some sociological things that pushed her in that direction as well. But the very basic emphasis was to kill babies and to reduce certain types of births. Does that sound biblical to you? Does that sound scriptural to you? Does it sound godly to you? Doesn't sound like it to me. Matthew 19, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belong the kingdom of heaven." Little children are an important part of God's plan. And one of the things we have to do is recognize that we can't stop that. We can't obscure that or obstruct that in any way, shape, or form and be godly ourselves. In Exodus chapter 16, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. Now, you know, we know that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Sodom in particular because of sodomy, we call it, but we don't even really know what that means. But she and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. What was Sodom's sin? Having plenty and not aiding the poor and needy. Now that should be a caution to us as well, shouldn't it? When it says pure religion before God and the Father is this, to take care of the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, to care for them in their need, should mean that we have to see ourselves as the means of God to help the poor and the needy. But here he says this was the guilt of Sodom, not doing so. Oops, I guess I shouldn't turn it off. All right, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." By the way, in Luke, when that's recorded, it says, "Blessed are the poor," period. But the idea here is the poor. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. God intends the poor to have a place in his throne, doesn't he? Matthew 19, verse 21. If you will be perfect, and he's talking to the rich young ruler who comes to him and says, what do I need to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? If you would be perfect, sell all that you have and distribute it to the poor. Then you will have treasure in heaven, and then come and follow me. Luke, he says, take up your cross and follow me. The idea that we would have something more to do. Now, by the way, I think I said once in here a couple of years ago, God's not, people will say, God's never going to ask me to sell everything I have and give it to the poor. Well, he did tell somebody that once, didn't he? And we have to be aware that he could be telling us that sometime. Matthew 26. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? Do you remember the situation? The woman comes with an alabaster jar of cruise oil, and she anoints his feet with that oil. Very expensive, by the way. We're not sure the exact amount, but it's expected it would have been a month or two of income, at least. And she used it on his feet. This could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. Well, that sounds noble, doesn't it? The disciples are upset because she's used it on their master's feet, and they're saying, we could have used this money for the poor. But look what Jesus says. Jesus, aware of this, says, why do you trouble the woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Now, one of the problems we have in our modern time is we think the poor are always going to be poor. And of course, that's kind of silly in America, where we have the Horatio Alger story. We have the idea of a poor person rising up to become wealthy, to become successful, as we call it, to become somebody, as we sometimes call it. But we still have a tendency to think that the poor are always going to be poor. In fact, I heard a guy actually say this once, the poor are always going to be poor. No, that's not what it says. It says the poor will always be with you. There will always be poor among you. And actually, he says this in the Old Testament as well as in the New. But in Galatians chapter 2, I'm going to finish out with this concept here. Paul talks about when he went to Jerusalem, and the disciples there received his message. And he says, when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. There was an expression here concerning Paul going to the Gentiles at this point, and when they realized that God had provided the gospel to the Gentiles as well, through Paul and Barnabas, they extended what they called the right hand of fellowship. A very good, strong emphasis that's saying they accepted us. And they only asked us to do this one thing, to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Now, what's interesting about this, in my opinion, is actually a couple of things. One, the Old Testament emphasized taking care of the poor so much that it was an ingrained part of the Jewish culture. An ingrained part of their Jewish religious service to God was to take care of the poor. Remember, we started off in Deuteronomy talking about how if there's someone poor among you, you take care of them no matter what it is that they need. Here he says, only they asked us to remember the poor. Well, remembering the poor would have been something Paul would have wanted to do anyway, wouldn't he? It would have been something he would have naturally been drawn to do. But he says, don't forget when you're going to the Gentiles to take care of the poor. Apparently, this is God's plan from the very beginning. There will always be poor among you, he says, but you have to take care of them. They're not intended to fall through the cracks and die. Do you remember in the Old Testament it talked about leaving the edges and the corners of the fields when you harvest? Do you know why that was? Specifically, it was for the poor. It was for those who didn't have the means to own property, to take care of them, or to even work for themselves. Now, what's interesting about it, they had to go get it themselves. They didn't harvest that section and then set it aside for them to go get, although we do find in the story of Ruth that they actually did help her some in that regard. The reality was, though, these were left for the poor and the needy. God had this as a plan, and it was an ingrained plan even from the law of Moses. In James chapter 1, religion that is pure and undefiled is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. I'm not going to talk about the unstained from the world. We've talked about that quite a bit. We're going to talk about it more in the future. But to take care of the fatherless and the widows, the orphans and the widows. By the way, the word visit here is actually visiting in more of a sense of what do they need? I'm looking to see what they need, and then I'm following up to take care of it. So the fatherless and the widows are actually cared for by us. And the literal translation here, religion pure and undefiled with God and the Father, is to look after orphans and widows in their tribulation, and unspotted to keep himself from the world. Friends, I don't know whether my talking about eugenics actually mattered to you or not, but it upsets me. It upsets me a lot. Evolutionary thinking, we say, well, what difference does it make whether they teach evolution in the schools or not? Well, here's one way in which it does. Babies are not babies anymore. People are not people anymore. Literally, one of the eugenics movement's people was quoted as saying, we're just bags of meat. Now that's pretty telling, isn't it? Pretty straightforward talk. They literally see us as nothing but bags of meat, and that we are not worthy of anything compassionate. An individual will take, the old Roman law, they would expose a baby. What exposing a baby meant is they put it outside in the elements, and they would let it sit there for 3 days, I believe it was. And they were testing to see if the gods approved of it living. If the gods did not kill it in that 3-day time period, then they'd take it back in the house and nurse it and take care of it. We put NIC units together, neonatal intensive care units. Yes, that's very good. And the same medical facility will have abortion clinics. Now, what's the difference between taking a 5-year-old and killing him and a 5-month-old fetus and killing it? What's the difference? Well, one hasn't taken a breath yet, so it can't be alive, right? Now, you can make the arguments all you want. That's kind of what it boils down to. One hasn't taken a breath yet. That's really the only difference. An individual went into an anti-abortion clinic, actually, and had an ultrasound done of their baby. It was a first trimester baby in the 3rd month. And the baby was jumping and doing its work and all this effort. You say, at 3 months old, they're not supposed to be able to do that. Yeah, well, this one was. She had actually planned on having an abortion until she saw that. I think that's wonderful. But the fact is, babies are babies no matter when. I believe personally in conception. I don't think the Bible teaches anything different. I think also the Bible teaches that children are given by God. Now we know the biology of it, but that doesn't change the fact that God gave the child. I believe that we don't have the right to kill another human being for any reason at all. Now somebody says, what about self-defense? Don't get into that stuff. I'm just saying in terms of us making a conscious choice to kill somebody, I don't think we have the right to do that. I don't think we have a right to do it because they're poor, because they're mentally deficient, because they're uglier than us, whatever that means, because their skin color is different, because their eyes are different, their hair color is different, their eyes are too close together. By the way, the eugenics movement also developed into the phrenology movement. I don't know if you guys remember any of that. The bumps on the head actually could determine what your mental capacities were, and yeah, pretty sharp stuff. Science for sure. Well, it didn't last very long, 3 or 4 decades, whatever. But the fact is, it started because people wanted to think for themselves. People didn't want to be humble before God. They wanted instead to be in control and make the decisions for themselves. It's unfortunate that we've come to that point in our society, but the fact is we have. And if we have, it's wrong. Now, we could be quiet about it, and we have been. We could continue to be quiet about it, and many of us will be. Or we can speak up. We don't have to effect change necessarily. I don't think God calls us for that. I think God calls us, though, to speak up. To say this isn't right. That it's not right to kill a child, no matter whether they're 5 years old or 5 months old in the womb. There's no reason to do this. It's an ungodly and an unscriptural way of thinking. And we have to make sure that we stand up and speak out. My opinion, we need to speak out. But if we see this, what's our religion? Pure religion is to take care of the fatherless and the widows, isn't it? Not to kill them, not to get rid of them, not to shun them, not to segregate them into institutions. That's a lot of what the institutionalization of the mentally ill was for a long time. Wasn't so much to improve them, to help them, to house them safely, but just to get them out of the way. They finally outlawed institutionalized of mentally ill, and we're complaining now because the mentally ill are not institutionalized. They're on the streets. They're in among us. Some of you in here, well, okay, maybe not. The idea, though, is that we want to be separated. We don't want to be tainted by their wrongness, whatever it is. But the fact is, we are, as a people, all in this together. And God respects the poor, loves the needy, loves those who have special needs as much as anybody of us. Well, at this time, we're going to offer an invitation. I want you to come if you need to be repentant, if you need to be baptized. If you come right now while we stand and while we sing.